Lenka, who is joining us online from Florida at a very ungodly hour. I'm immensely grateful for her for joining us at this time. So this is our sixth panel of the conference, and we will be talking about rethinking Europe's East-West divide, 20 years since the Big Bang enlargement. And we have a spectacular lineup of speakers today. So I'm very happy, as we have mentioned, we have Lenka Bustikova, who is the Director of Center of European Studies and a Professor of Political Science at the University of Florida. She was a former colleague here based at Oxford. She was born in Prague, and she's a part of the East European Politics Group in the Department of Politics. And her book on extreme reactions, radical right mobilization in Eastern Europe has received numerous awards, inspired many scholars to continue working in that fascinating area. And she is also currently the editor of East European Politics and the editor of Cambridge Elements, Politics and Society from Central Europe to Central Asia. Then we have Professor Dimitris Papadimitriou, who has worked on European Union external relations and EU enlargement policy. He has also worked on Europeanization, state building in EU's near abroad. Dimitris has worked at Yale and the University of Leeds, and he was also a visiting professor at Princeton and Yale and the London School of Economics. Currently, he's the co-editor of European Politics at Manchester University Press, and he's also the Vice Dean for Social Responsibility and Inclusion at the University of Manchester. And then we are joined by Mihail, Dr. Mihail Chiru, who is a colleague at Oxford. Mihail has been here in the Department of Politics and International Relations, as well as the Oxford School of Global Area Studies. He has previously worked at Southampton as well, at the University of Southampton, the Central European University, and his work focuses on legislative behavior, party politics, European Parliament, and its impact, as well as Eastern Europe. He has published extensively in highly regarded peer-reviewed journals. And last but not least, we have Professor Timothy Garton Ash. Of course, he doesn't need any introduction, but I'm sure you are all familiar with his work. He's the author of more than 11 books on the history of including the transformation of Europe. He has worked extensively over the last half a century. His most recent book is Homelands, A Personal History of Europe, and has been translated already into 21 languages. And he's a professor of European Studies here at the University of Oxford. And he's also written widely, including for The Guardian. And we are delighted to have all of you with us. Without further ado, we are going to make a start, and Lenka will start with her presentation. We have 15 minutes. Thank you again for joining us, Lenka. You can start.
Okay, thank you, Ali, for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. The sun is just coming up, so it's a wonderful way to start the day. I have prepared some loose thoughts about support for democracy in the East and in the West. I think everybody in the room knows that democracy, especially liberal democracy, is an endangered species. The stakes are very high, and therefore it's quite important to think about sources of support for democracy and possibly some origins of divergence and convergence between the East and the West. I don't have any answers. I just have a few conversation openers to think about what's going on in the East and the West. And a lot of sort of my current thoughts are sort of a joint current project with Bustikova, who is currently at Oxford. So I will talk first about sort of the general ideas about importance of democracy. Then I will talk about some recent studies that noticed some disturbing trends among young people versus so-called old people, and that it's possible that we are seeing a reversal in the sense that young people might become less supportive of democracy in Europe or in the world in general. Then I will talk a bit about differences between men and women, but again, I will have no answers why we observe the differences, only some thoughts. And then I will have a very empirically ungrounded sort of thoughts on types of mobilization from the bottom in the East versus in the West. And um, again, these are really sort of general remarks, and a lot of it is done with good brush, but it seems to me that one major difference in terms of mobilization patterns is that we observe a lot of mobilization. Some of it is ugly, but in general, there is more mobilization for democracy in the East. There is more mobilization for identity in the West, and then I will close up with some possible implications of the conflict in Gaza after October 7th. Um, so let me just talk briefly about support for democracy in general. This is a graph made by Kasia that is based on European Social Survey and shows um, importance of democracy. So the question in the survey asks whether democracy is important for people. The maximum that you can get on the scale is 10. So you can see that most attitudes are above the range of 7 or 7.5. So in general, adult citizens of all these countries are quite supportive of democracy. But there is a variation and there are some shifts over time, and I will come back to this later. But I think one thing that's noticeable is that if you eyeball this, at least I don't see any remarkable regional patterns. It seems to me that you have Italy that's regressing, Poland that's increasing in support of democracy despite of the turbulent area of backsliding. But in general, on the surface of it, there are no differences between the East and the West. We know from literature that support for democracy among citizens is considered critical for the emergence and stability of democracy. In most surveys, European citizens claim to support democracy. In Poland, for example, democracy was perceived as a critical step towards modernization and integration with Europe. And from the early 1990s, public endorsement of democracy over alternatives has been high, despite all the problems and turbulences. The research among Europeans on understanding democracy has revealed the lack of shared conception. So that's one of the biggest challenges of thinking about support for democracy and its sustainability, which I think concerns all of us. So we know that the support for democracy is very high, but there is a growing dissatisfaction with the current democratic system. So not only that people view democracy differently, and then you get these charts when no political patterns emerge, but we also know that political elites conceptualize it differently, and this is a particular struck in places where there's a presence of illiberal leaders, that the concepts of democracy are being tweaked and twisted. And so not only different groups have different divergent attitudes towards democracy, but but elites view it differently, and in general satisfaction is sort of going down. So we should not take support for democracy of granted. It's a complex multifaceted concept. Of course, it is a common perception among social scientists that stable democracy requires citizens who believe in principles of democracy and have to support it. But again, we should not conflate it with satisfaction that relies on performance. And so what these questions about the importance of democracy measure is something that we call diffuse support for democracy, overall approved democracy, and abstract democratic support. So now let's think about, the East and West. So this is just one way to slice the pie. But in general, a lot of the surveys show that that in overall support democracy in both East and West is very high, and I wouldn't take that for granted. But the East, survey after survey shows that the support for democracy is lower. And also, there's a lot of research that shows that citizens are less engaged and less trusting. And there might be an evidence that there is a diminished commitment to democracy and that there is a strong disillusionment with the practice of democracy. So now, of course, the go-to argument is the issue of legacy. So if we are thinking about East and West, of course, we are thinking about the post-communist bloc versus the Western bloc. And so, there are basically three flavors of arguments when it comes to legacy and why it might be the case that people in the East in overall support democracy quite a bit, but a bit less than people, that citizens in the West. So there is an idea of a communist shadow, comes from Tucker, that basically it's the Moses idea that the old has to die and the younger generation will flourish and embrace democratic pluralism. However, and I will speak, to sort of recent findings by FOA and others, in global perspective, and not just in the East, it's becoming the case that young people are tired of democracy. They don't view it as it's a system that delivers for them, and they support it less than older generations. And so there is a big debate about the generation impact on support for democracy. It's not settled, but the debate and some of these disturbing findings are out there. If you think about the legacy arguments in the East, there are few ways to think about it, and all will yield, complicated results. So the, old-fashioned argument is that the old generation is contaminated, was socialized under communism, they need to die, and then, the future belongs to the young and democratic. Now, there's another argument that says that the experience of democracy has been complicated and toxic in many ways. A lot of young people have bad experience with it, and they will not embrace it. And there's sort of a flavor to this argument, which, for example, I have heard when people talk about sort of initial protests against restriction of abortion rights in Poland. The argument was all the women on the streets that initially, went to the streets were middle-aged women who, understood the importance of these restrictions, but these were protests against democracy, and the argument was that the middle-aged people who left free communism understand the state. So then actually the argument would be that the young, because they haven't lived through these, brutal and horrible regimes, they just don't understand what's at stake and what can be lost. And so again, going back to this graph, this really doesn't allow us to settle the debate. If we think about, this is from a social survey from 2020, if we think about some arguments about how important it is to live in a democratically governed country. Again, I don't think that there are any striking regional patterns at all, other than that overall the Western Europe might score a slightly higher. And if we go back sort of to the graph that I just showed you a moment ago, actually the good news that among the 16 countries analyzed here, most of them witnessed strengthening of democratic attitudes, and Poland is actually on the top after Portugal, again, despite democratic backsliding. So how can we sort of think about what democracy means, what would be sort of the alternative ways to think about democratic support. So one thing I will talk about briefly is sort of a newest research that sort of challenges the idea that all is good and bright with the young. The idea that the young will be more supportive of democracy comes, among others, from modernization hypothesis that says that liberal attitudes and tolerance have increased across generations in Western societies, and people with high levels of political interest are consistently found to have higher levels of turnout and to participate more. So the idea is that the values and norms are transmitted through socialization, and then that would mean that the individuals from post-Soviet nations that might have been less exposed to normative changes will be less supported. There is also sort of a thinking that maybe countries or citizens that have been exposed to radical right parties will have lower support and lower turnout. Now, going back to something that I already talked about is a sort of research by FOA and Moon from 2016 and 2021. And there's a very disturbing finding in the Center for Democracy report from 2021 that basically says on a global sample, European studies, they find that youth are less satisfied with the performance of democracy compared to prior cohorts at the same age in life. They also find, sort of interestingly, that Central and Eastern Europe seems to consolidate the legitimacy of their democratic institutions among younger generations over time, but that there is a stronger evidence of intergenerational divide in Southern Europe. And moreover, Western Europe exhibits generation divergence, where younger generations decline in democratic satisfaction compared to past generations. And again, this actually follows from their article from, that made a big splash in 2016 that shows that younger respondents are less likely to protect freedom of speech, more likely to support radicalism. So this, a lot of these findings have been challenged by Welflubot, Norris, and so this debate is not settled. But there is another study by SAG that also shows that democratic value orientations are sort of lower for citizens younger than 30 years. And so this actually inspired probing with Kasia into the differences between generations in the East and West and men and women. So this is, this is sort of our graph using European Social Survey from 2020. So what you can see here that in general, again, the importance of democracy is at 10, it's the maximum. So we see that all the adults, are above 8. So that means everybody is very supportive of democracy. On the top, you see the men in the West, and the dark dot are young men, so men from 18 to 29, and the lighter dot is old, so old is 30 plus. So we sort of joke about it, but this is a crude cut. So what you can see is that, yes, men in the West are supportive, but the young men are less supportive on overall of democracy than their older peers. And we also see that the gap, and this is actually a significant gap, we tested for this, is quite big between the young men and the so-called old men. There is also a gap among men in the East, but the gap is much smaller. So in overall, they would be slightly less supportive, but the gap is not as wide as in the West. And if we compare it to women in the West, the gap between the generations is not that large, and the gap between the women in the East, young women and women over 30 is quite negligible. And one can also see that the young women in the West are the ones that support the democracy the most out of all, young people. So another way to look at this, some of this analysis is repeated. We looked at sort of differences between 2012 and 2020. So this is ESS 6 versus ESS 10. And some of these results are persistent over time, and we are going to be sort of digging deeper. So on the top, you see one thing that stands out, which is to say that the major difference between the West and the East is that there is a generation gap in support for democracy in the West, and the generational gap in support for democracy in the East does not exist. So that means that in the East, young people 18 to 29 are not lagging behind the older generation, but in the West, this gap is quite pronounced. And again, the language is statistically significant. So these differences are remarkable. The East is less supportive of the democracy, but the gap is not there. And the gap, if you look at sort of the bottom panel, which is sliced by gender, the gap is especially pronounced among men and especially among men in the West. So the Eastern men are diverging a bit, but sort of the biggest, challenger and the biggest sort of, again, believing this very good analysis. So the biggest danger or the biggest sort of issue in the future might be, lagging support for democracy among young men in the West. Now, I'm afraid you're going to ask me why, and I have to say that we don't know. This is sort of exploratory, but we find these findings and we checked for this quite starkly. So we think that what can be going on. So we know from some other research that men, especially young men in many Western European countries, including the United States, are starting to lean more conservative than women. And some of it might have to do is that they don't sort of own liberal democracy. They don't think it's delivering for them. There might be some educational attainment behind. We know that women more and more supersede men in higher education. So maybe some of these differences are due to educational gaps.
Lenka,
It's also possible that there is an issue of resentment, that, we all know that there is a massive recalibration of gender relations between men and women. I think this is, this is happening in the East, but sort of the, very strong progressivism is more pronounced in the West. And so this might be the case why, if men sort of associate democracy and changes in democracy with progressivism, maybe that's why they're becoming less supportive of democracy. So these are really, as I sort of mentioned at the beginning, these are really my, very simple initial thoughts about this gap. So I think the gap is real. We don't know why, and we are having some thoughts about that. I want to conclude also with even less empirically, grounded observations about mobilization for democracy in the East and West. And again, this is very, very crude. So if you think about the largest protests for democracy in past, 5-10 years, they happened in Poland, Czech Republic, Ukraine, and perhaps Serbia. So this is a picture of protests for democracy in Prague. And in the West, of course, there are protests against far right, but a lot of the protests in the West are of an economic nature. There are more protests, that deal with the environment. And a lot of the protests in the West are protests for, I would say, the rights. I mean, that doesn't mean, of course, that protests in the East are not for the rights. But it seems to me that I cannot, think of an equivalent mass protest just for democracy in the West. And it might be the case that, the East has horrible experience with populist far-right leaders. Again, the stakes are high, and maybe that explains the difference in mobilization. However, we know that a lot of West European countries has elected, populist, right-wing governments as well. So I think that's something to think about, and maybe I'm completely off. And then, sort of one last thing I want to mention and conclude is that we don't know how the conflict between Israel and Palestinians is Gaza is going to unfold. But I think this is going to create also a huge cleavage between the East and the West in general. And again, it's a massive oversimplification. The East European governments have a much stronger pro-Israeli foreign policy in stark contrast to the West. They align more sort of with the position of the United States than many West European governments. And also, the proportion of Muslim populations in the East is quite negligible. So I think in the future, if some of these protests for the rights of Palestinians proceed, we'll also see sort of a big divide between East and West, because some of the pro-Palestinian protests just didn't happen in the East at all. So to conclude, going back to sort of my previous thoughts, I think the battle for the soul of democracy is going to be waged through the battle for the soul of young men in Europe, and I think in the long run they will have to be convinced to embrace the regime, and I think some sort of I think there is a ticking bomb potentially, or a huge source of weakness, and especially in Western democracies when it comes to allegiances of young men, and perhaps less so in the East. But again, these are all speculations. Thank you for your patience.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lenka. And now, Dimitris will tell us a little bit more.
I will only tell you three things, I hope. I was given instructions from A, which I don't disobey, to sort of talk a little bit about where we are in terms of scholarship in East-West divided areas, perhaps where we could explore a little bit further. So, as I said, I will try and raise three things. The first and most obvious is, to me at least, is why EU enlargement and the apparent end of East-West divide in the 90s did not lead to a greater sense of political community in the EU, and by that I mean both why we haven't seen very substantive convergence between East and West in that front, but also why is it that we have seen greater fragmentation amongst the old EU member states as well. So it seems to me that the hypothesis that enlargement would have led to a greater unity within the European Union has not fully materialized. And that, of course, takes us to the kind of the way in which adaptational pressures that came out of enlargement, both for Eastern Europe but also for all member states, played out. And here you can talk really about two separate issues. One is how perhaps conditionality has been instrumentalized, both pre-accession and post-accession. There's plenty of literature about this. I'm not pretending to be bringing you here anything particularly new. So that, we know a lot about it. But I think there are a couple of things that we don't know, and I think that they're worth exploring. One is how this kind of enlargement-led, conditionality-led adaptational pressure impacted on informal networks in Eastern Europe. And because I think Eastern Europe, as indeed Southern European democracies, work a lot on informality, on areas of political interaction that very often escape formal institutions, escape the radar of policymakers in Brussels and elsewhere. And how this kind of informality can be understood, theorized, how can we link it to outcomes of democratic advancement or retrenchment. To me, at least, it seems an interesting area to consider. There's a second thing linked to this, which is how can we look at conditionality? A lot of our work on conditionality tend to be on Eastern Europe, but more recently we have had forms of conditionality in Southern Europe, particularly in the context of the adjustment programs that many Southern European countries have gone through. And there we see kind of forms of Europeanization that are a lot more coercive, a lot more intrusive, in a different context to that of enlargement, of course. And the thing that, as a Greek that has a very strong interest in Southern Europe, but also experienced, also through my own research, this kind of more intrusive Europeanization in the context of economic adjustment, is when and how these kind of more powerful, more intrusive forms of Europeanization occur. To me, 2015 is the year zero here, right? I always remember that 2015 was the peak of the Greek crisis, where more intrusive forms of adjustment were introduced in the country. But it is also the year of the migration crisis, both of which posed fatal threats to the European Union. On the economic side, more intrusive Europeanization. On the migration side, a lot less so. Why? Considering that they were both extremely important for the domestic audience in many powerful European countries. So worth exploring. I think that many East-West sort of scholars like Europeanization, like conditionality, but I think there is scope for a little bit more comparative work on this. Going back to the issue of, if you like, the lack of convergence or the fragmentation of the political community within the EU since enlargement, I think there is also an area to explore here that relates to supranational activism. In the early 1990s, of course, the European Commission, supranational European institutions play a very important role in shaping the agenda. In the early 90s, under the Prodi Commission, again, significant input. Since then, less so. And why does that matter? Well, it matters because it links, if you like, to another area of kind of interest of mine, which is the discursive dimension of European integration. How Europe, in other words, gets sold to the public. That is then linked to many other issues of detachment, Euroscepticism, and all the other stuff that we have discussed. And looking at the discursive dimension of Europeanization since the EU enlargement, I think it's interesting. It's not very good, frankly, but why it's not very good is a very interesting research question, and I think it's worth exploring. So that's my first point, right? It related to the fragmentation of the political community. The second point relates to the obvious and more hidden impact of economic impact of the reunification of parts of the European continent. And the economic impact of EU enlargement, again, plenty of literature there. I'm not bringing here something terribly innovative to the table, but I think we don't know enough about how that impact was internalized in the old member states. We see snippets of it. We saw them in Brexit here. We see it in certain sort of narratives from right-wing parties across Western Europe. But we don't know, I feel we don't know enough. And the economic changes since enlargement have been extraordinary. I'll just share with you a couple of, I'm not going to bore you with too many statistics, but if you look at the GDP per capita in terms of purchasing power, which is the best way to look at these things comparatively, what you find is that Estonia, Lithuania, the Czech Republic are now richer than Spain. That Greece, alongside Slovakia, in terms of GDP per capita in purchasing powers, right? Greece, alongside Slovakia, are the second poorest in the EU. Poland, Hungary, above Portugal. What does that tell you? That the old distinction, I mean, if you are perhaps of more advanced age like I am, that, there is Western Europe, there is Northern Europe, Western Europe, Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, in terms of the economic pecking order, is changing. And we need to understand that, and I'm linking this back to Lenka's point about angry young men and angry men. Well, why would men be angry? Well, in many of these countries, men are the main breadwinners. So the impact of this economic reordering matters, right? And of course it matters for us to understand the substantial depletion of the productive base in Southern Europe, but also in Western and Northern Europe, and the transfer of some of this activity in Eastern Europe. But it also, I guess, helped us think of more recent economic crises, and particularly asset bubbles that get built in Western Europe. The property bubble, for example, which creates a lot of tension and a lot of aggression in many Western European countries and Southern European countries for that matter, but from which Eastern European countries, because they have much higher levels of home ownership, are partly insulated. So you can see, I guess, in very broad strokes, why certain men and women, for that matter, in Western Europe can be angry. And for us to be able to understand this kind of massive economic impact that enlargement has brought to the EU is important to understand the source of these frustrations, but also to articulate policies to mitigate them. And on that front, we're not doing great either. I'll finish with the third point, which is this kind of East-West divide. I mean, clearly, the East-West divide hasn't disappeared, in the sense that there are still many countries in Europe that want to be part of the EU, and they're not. And there are many others who are beginning to be very frustrated, aggressive, angry about the EU. The point I want to make here is that it seems to me that the dividing lines between EU and non-EU are hardening. So in that sense, we see a major departure from the logic of the old European neighborhood policy. No one talks about that anymore. If you look at, obviously, relations with Russia, that kind of border is hardening. Turkey, that kind of dividing line is hardening. Southern Mediterranean, migration and so on, that border is hardening. Now, what does that tell us? It tells us that borders around the European Union are likely to become more securitized, are becoming more securitized. Two sets of questions worth reflecting on and writing interesting papers. Is this desirable? I haven't got an answer, I'm just throwing the question there. The second question, is it inevitable? Many people will say, well, look at Russia, I think it is inevitable. If it is inevitable, what does that mean for the defense capabilities of the European Union? What does it mean about our defense industries, our spending, our procurement? Many big unanswered questions. But also, if the borders around the EU are hardening, what does that mean for the EU's ability to crisis manage peripheral conflicts outside of its border, which then spill over back to its mainland, right? Through immigration, through other things. So, is the EU's influence in its near abroad weakening? If it is weakening, what does that mean? In economic terms too, if borders become more important, if borders have become more sealed, and there is a global context that encourages these, where would the European project go in terms of economic expansion? Assuming that we all buy the argument that capitalism is inherently expansionist, right? Where will it expand to? 30 years ago, it expanded to the east. Where will it expand next? Or will it retract? And if it retracts, what does that mean for the European continent? On that happy note, I'll finish.
Wonderful, thank you. Yes, please. Absolutely. Thank you, Mihail.
It's really a pleasure to be part of this panel, a privilege as well, after talking with and after very distinguished speakers. So I'll try to share my slides so that Lenka can see them as well. Yes, I need to make it a bit bigger. Can anyone help here? Sorry.
I think because it's a PDF. This
Yes,
is the reason
yes.
why I don't think it will be. We were having this problem
Hit the
yesterday.
plus button on top of it.
Yeah.
There is a plus
There is
button.
Oh, yeah, yes, you're right. Thank you very much. Okay, so, and I guess,
It's fine like this, don't worry.
yeah, the next slide.
Page number.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. So I'll reflect on the questions that Ellie set up for this panel with respect to two topics. The first one is the democratic backsliding and whether that has deepened the East-West divide in the EU. And the second one, for that one, I'll bring my crystal ball and I'll try to make a case for the fact that climate change mitigation might really create a bigger divide than we have seen until now between the East and the West. Okay, so with democratic backsliding, I'm sure you're familiar with the concept. It's about basically state-led, deliberate and systematic dismantling of checks, liberal democratic checks on executive power. You can't study today democratic backsliding without referring to Hungary and Poland. Now, of course, we talked about this yesterday. This has been maybe in an unfair way projected on other Eastern European member states. If you look at countries that have suffered from episodes of backsliding, or whether there were people who wanted to emulate Orban, unfortunately there is a concentration of cases in the East. And this is amenable to this kind of East-West divide that forms the focus of our conference here. So, of course, backsliding can bring a fatal wound to EU integration because it threatens the legality of that integration. You can contest how legal acts of the council are if they're signed by ministers from authoritarian states. There's black box of contesting the supremacy of EU law, and of course, backsliding has weakened the EU's soft power. So, in a way, it has been a sign of the failure of EU conditionality. It puts into question future rounds of enlargement and it undermines any claims of the legitimacy that EU might have for democracy promotion in elsewhere. So, in a joint project with Natasha Vrush from the University of Fribourg, we were interested in two main questions. So, first of all, has democratic backsliding indeed deepened the East-West divide in the EU? And second, maybe actually it has helped to create bridges between populist radical right actors in the two sides of the continent. So to do this, we focused on studying very different types of behavior in one institution where you see Eastern and Western politicians interacting, the European Parliament. So we looked at roll call vote coalitions, agenda setting initiatives and parliamentary speeches, and we basically relied on qualitative and quantitative data to study that. We see that in discourses, in debates about parliamentary backsliding, there is an alignment of discourses around contestation of norms, around three dimensions, and of course those opposing intervention of the EU in this backsliding cases would want to mobilize an East-West divide, point to double standards that are applied when there is a crisis of democracy in the East, but not when it is in the West. And they would want to defend their own right to have their own concept of democracy and denounce Western intervention and mobilize anti-Western resentment feelings in the East. On the other side, for the defenders of EU intervention in these backsliding crises, they would like to appeal to a shared identity that all of us Europeans have, and that has to do with democratic values and the rule of law as something that we all cherish. So I can't put it better than this Slovakian MEP from Fico's party when she basically lists this long series of debates where one by one countries in the East were discussed because of the democratic problems that were there, and she makes the point that this is not really conducive to cooperation between the member states. So you can see already that on the side of MEPs from these governing parties in Eastern Europe, they were really trying to mobilize this divide and to coalesce other MEPs in the East, and Western European MEPs were very aware and cautious of this potential problem when such controversial and sensitive topics are debated. So if you look at who talks and what kind of positions they take in these debates in the European Parliament, you see that there are both arguments in favor and against EU intervention in both sides of the continent, both in the 7th and in the 8th term. you also see that there is a sort of shyness from some Eastern European MEPs to enter in this debate. And this, in a way, also mirrors what happens in Council hearings on Article 7. So the Baltics, for instance, they wouldn't want to annoy Poland, but they also don't want to be seen as not supporting this kind of EU actions. So what would be the question, what would be the answer that I will be able to give to this question? Has the backsliding strengthened the East-West divide in EU politics? I would say it's a cautious no. Because if you look beyond debates at, for instance, voting and also position taking, you see that although Eastern European MEPs are a bit more reluctant than Western European MEPs to approve or go along EU ideas of sanctioning or intervening in these crises, what matters more in the end is their ideological position, the ideological positions of the parties. So in a quantitative model that will explain much more. To respond to the other question, we haven't seen a lot of federation of the populist radical right from East and West around this backsliding crisis, although that would have been an opportunity. So they don't vote more along the same lines, neither in issues of democracy or in issues of enlargement or quality issues in the EU. So they remain divided in different political groups with very different agendas. They don't collaborate much in trying to shape the agenda either. So maybe that's a positive conclusion. Now, the second topic I wanted to touch upon has to do with this efforts of climate change mitigation, right? So I think that's the next big thing that can be mobilized by politicians in the East. So on the one hand, on the cultural dimension, these efforts are amenable to this kind of discourse of all the cosmopolitan elites from Brussels, which are out of touch with the ordinary person in Bratislava or Bucharest. They want to impose things on us. They are this green bully who will take away our cars, our diesel cars, and take away our meat. So you see there a quote from a co-leader of a radical right party in the Romanian parliament, arguing not only that the EU will take away the meat, but they will force us to eat products from insects. So really, it's horrible. But it's not just that. It's not, and I don't want to make a caricature of this kind of cultural arguments, but there are also this kind of redistributive impacts that climate change mitigation will have, right? So we know already from the literature, political economy literature, that carbon taxing, for instance, is really regressive. So it hits harder the poor. Now in Eastern Europe, we have those that suffered a lot from the transition, and they turned to radical right for a reason. And that had to do with economic grievances in some sense. So in Eastern Europe, you have much more widespread energy poverty, which again might be accentuated by this climate change mitigation efforts. It's also a question of losing jobs not only in the fossil fuel industries and those related to them, but also maybe losing some competitiveness in sectors that Eastern Europeans are really proud of, like the automotive sector. So, I mean, if you go towards electric cars, maybe the Chinese have already an advantage there with the batteries and so on, so we just shoot ourselves in the foot. You might say at this point, oh well, but these are the arguments that the Salvinis and the Wilders of this world are making anyway. They're making them in Western Europe, so why should we care? Why should we think that they matter more in the East? Well, I would say that should be the case for two reasons, both on elite and mass level. So on elite level, we know already from the literature that governments are more likely to impose ambitious climate policy when they don't face a lot of electoral competitiveness. So when governments are more stable. And Eastern Europe is the total opposite of that. In the 2010s, Roberts was talking about hyper-accountability. In Eastern Europe, if you're the government, you lose elections, unless you're Orban and you're sort of tampering with institutions, right? So this kind of pressure of not upsetting the voters is much harder, I would say, and much pressing in Eastern Europe. And then you don't have a pro-environment agenda mobilized because there aren't really any green politicians or any, relevant politicians with a green agenda. Now, there are also very different citizen attitudes in the East. Researchers here at Oxford have noticed that unlike what you think if you buy into post-materialist theory, there is not a decreasing but but a widening gap in pro-environmental attitudes when you compare East with the West. There's also more skepticism whether climate change is happening and whether it's anthropocentric or not in the East than in the West. And there is a more intense green backlash already towards the targets of the EU. So if you compare this support for the target of reaching net zero in 2050 that the EU has enshrined, there is not much backlash in the West really, despite what some, I don't know, journalists might want to make of that, but there is quite a bit of backlash against that in a few Eastern European countries. So we maybe see this already happening. So apart from Finland, basically all other places where this backlash is larger than the margin of error, in this polls from 2019 and 2013 they are in Eastern Europe. Okay, so those of you who are more familiar with the European Green Deal might say that, well, EU has thought about that, and that's why the mechanisms of the just transition are well designed to placate these concerns, especially in the East. So compensate losers of the green transition, diversify vulnerable regional economies, cover investment in energy and infrastructure, transport and energy infrastructures. Well, there will be also the problem of how that money is spent, the danger of state capture, and then being used actually to fund new illiberal projects, like knowing how EU funds have been used in Hungary, for instance. And then, of course, we know from the literature that this kind of dream reconversion of skills is not very easy, right? It's not that the miners of today will be the technicians of the solar panels of tomorrow, and also that the wage levels in new industries probably would be much lower because there won't be unionization. I mean, there isn't much unionization in Eastern Europe left, unfortunately, either. So I'll conclude with research agenda. So what should we study then if this is likely to happen? So maybe it won't happen because it would be tempered by within region variation. So there might be some structural differences that really matter. So there's no country as dependent in Eastern Europe on Poland as Poland is. Maybe in Bulgaria you have some regions which are still vulnerable, but in other countries they have got rid of their coal in the 90s already, and maybe they actually are very interested in developing renewables. It might also be that extreme weather events that would happen, especially in the southern part of Eastern Europe, might help change a bit public opinion, or at least make climate change adaptation, if not mitigation, more palatable to voters. Also, a very interesting and important question is how the EU will deal with the likely opposition from the East on these topics. And I guess the easy answer would be that it would try to do what it has done until now, to go to this kind of quick technocratic fixes, get Orban in a room and promise him billions to try to go beyond this or dilute this ambitions even more. Would it be, on the contrary, that differentiated integration, which is a taboo in the East and something audacious in the East are not welcoming either, or it would be something ideal, like finding a way to address more substantively this change. And I'll conclude with this last potential research agenda, which I think is even more interesting than this one that I emphasized until now. This is how these new topics will change, and if they will change party competition in Eastern Europe, who will win and lose from this. So I guess this is a bit 90s and early 2000s all over again. So will the social democratic parties that have synced in Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, will they jump on implementing costly policies in the way they sort of embraced austerity measures or welfare retrenchment? Will they be punished by voters and that create more, I don't know, for vote pool for other projects, maybe liberal? Or on the contrary, would they be able to play with this and capitalize on this in the way we've seen the Spanish socialists maybe doing that? Of course, no easy answers to that. Thank you very much for your attention.
So, this is a terrific initiative, as I said yesterday. You have my 100% vote for it. I have the misfortune fortune to be the last speaker in this panel, so I'm going to try and be brief, and if you don't mind, I'm going to address the larger framing of the project as a bridge to the next session, which unfortunately I can't attend, and make just 4 points. Starting with how we parse your title, Rethinking Europe's East-West Divide. So if we think of East-West Divide as something, a singular, existing, objectively existing thing, like rethinking the Franco-German frontier or the Eiffel Tower or Hadrian's Wall, then this is a purely historical project. Because as a singular, objective thing, the East-West Divide only existed between 1949 and 1989, right? And as a pedantic empirical historian, I would say Austria only in 1955, Berlin Wall only in 1961, and by the way, importantly, where do we put Yugoslavia in the 1970s and 1980s on that spectrum? Some maps of the Iron Curtain put Yugoslavia one side, some the other. But it sure as hell existed for 40 years, and it had major consequences. So if you doubt that post-communism, the legacies of that experience is still a significant factor. Read Ivan Kirstov and Stephen Holmes' book on the light that failed. It clearly is, but it's a factor of diminishing relative significance against many other factors that are coming into play. So if you take the biggest endogenous crisis of the European Union, bar none, which is the Eurozone crisis, the key divide was north-south, not east-west. Okay? So Estonia and Latvia lined up with the North Europeans, with Finland, the Netherlands and Germany as the fiscal disciplinarians, against West European countries like Spain, Portugal and Italy, who were regarded as a feckless south. So multiple divides. If, however, you think of the sentence, rethinking Europe's East-West divide, I think that one is interfering with this one, so let me turn that one on. That's what happens. That one off. Take it far away. If you think of it as a statement like rethinking socialism or nationalism, or most relevantly Orientalism, then it has a contemporary relevance. Because what I call intra-European Orientalism, that is to say the tradition which, as Larry Wolff showed us in his famous book Inventing Eastern Europe, goes back to the Enlightenment, of viewing the eastern half of the continent in a certain way, is absolutely still alive and kicking. Its most extraordinary example is West-East Germany. This is a remarkable book by an East German literary scholar, Dirk Oschmann, called Der Osten eine westdeutsche Erfindung, the East a West German discovery. And he demonstrates that Germany has the really remarkable achievement of having not just Orientalism in one country, but colonialism in one country, right? And it's still a very persistent stereotype. Now, when we advanced the notion of Central Europe in the 1980s and 1990s, we were going up, starting obviously with Kundera, by the way, 40 years next month from the first English language publication of Kundera's famous essay on Central Europe, Georgi Conrad and others. We were going up against both these stereotypes, right? So we were going up against the real existing East-West divide, but also against intra-European Orientalism, bringing its own dangers of a different kind of Orientalism. Because if you look at the Central European discourse, it was the othering of Russia and the othering of the Balkans. Headline in the Czech Weekly, Respect, just before the Velvet Divorce, Czech Weekly, alone to Europe or together to the Balkans, right? So it brought its own dangers of essentialism and cultural determinism and assumptions of civilizational superiority. But nonetheless, geopolitically, Central Europe triumphed in 2004. That was, in a way, the moment of triumph. The irony is that since 2004, because of some of the developments that Mihail was talking about and Lenka, particularly in Poland and Hungary, Eastern Europe has come back. If you did a content analysis on West European media, you would find that Eastern Europe was strongly back. At the same time, because of the full-scale war in Ukraine, we have suddenly discovered that Ukraine is Central Europe. Henry Kissinger pronounced on this shortly before his death. He said, for the first time in modern history, Ukraine has become a major state in Central Europe. The oracle had spoken. So you see, Central Europe is now to the east of Eastern Europe, right? So, as a subject of, so to speak, cultural and intellectual studies, discourse analysis, identity studies, that's still something very real. So that was my second point. Third point, Ellie, your great concern, the organization of academic life. So universities are institutions full of people who, on the whole, have liberal or progressive views. That is true. But they're also incredibly conservative institutions in terms of the organization of knowledge, research, and teaching. And so basically, as you all know, we have still inherited what were Cold War structures of the organization of our thinking about Europe. Institutes, journals, East European politics and society, chairs, courses, funding, all are still fundamentally structured in this way. And by the way, when we have a course in Russian and East European studies, one might ultimately also ask the question, why Russia alone, of all countries in Europe, is to be named as the title of a course of an institute? Because it was a superpower? Because it had a great empire? Because it has nuclear weapons? Why exactly in 2034 should institutes and courses still be called Russia and East European? Why not German and East European, or whatever you want to call it? So academic life, the organization of our academic life, is limping far behind realities, not just political, but also economic, trade relations, investment, social, and cultural. So my final set of observations is about how we go up against that. If that is we agree that is your project, our project. It says in the Talmud, if you don't know where you want to go, any road is good. So it helps to have a long-term vision. So if someone gave me $10 billion to set up a new university, I would organize it like this. I would have very strong disciplinary departments, because we have to start with our disciplines, history, political science, economics, anthropology, culture. And then I would have a strongly interdisciplinary school of European studies. No other adjectives, no other words in there, European studies. Now, one or two of you will say, well, why not European and Eurasian studies? Because after all, we've got to do something about the post-Soviet space. I see the point, but if you think about it, you're then again privileging the East-West axis. Because as Dimitris rightly said, Europe has two other major open frontiers. One to the south across the Mediterranean. The ancient Greeks and Romans would have thought it ridiculous to study Europe without looking at the littoral of the entire Mediterranean. There are multiple connections across there. Can someone explain to me why Turkey is accepted as a European country but Morocco is not? Try that on the historians. So it has an open frontier across the Mediterranean, and across the Atlantic, by the way, both Atlantics, the Anglophone North Atlantic, but also the Lusophone and Hispanophone Southern Atlantic. So my idea of this Dream Institute, when someone has given me $10 billion, would programmatically accept the fuzziness, the openness, the complexity of all frontiers, not just the eastern, but also the southern and western frontier. And in that circumstance, academic life would be ahead of the political reality, not behind, because we haven't talked enough about the new project of enlargement on which the EU is notionally embarked, namely with Ukraine, Moldova and Georgia, which is one for a decade at least. So we would be ahead of the realities of enlargement rather than behind. How would you then go about it in your revolutionary project, Ellie? I have to say here, I have a bit of a problem with the way Lenka and to some extent Mihail was framing it. I can understand why, in terms of the current academic architecture, you're trying to bring together Central and East European studies and West European studies. But I think the basic framing of accepting there's West and East, and then asking what are the similarities and what are the differences, is not, in my view, the right way to go about it. If I see Lenka's graph, men West, men East, women West, women East, when hands up raised in this room who are Eastern women, who are Western men. Is this panel Western man, Eastern woman, Western man, Eastern man? Really? I don't think that makes sense in the lived European realities of 2024, let alone later in the 2020s. I think the way to go at it, and Lenka did say this is just one way to slice a pie, is to take the totality of your data set from across Europe and then to ask what are the significant differences and similarities that are revealed against multiple dimensions. So, for example, for me, looking at Lenka's table on the importance of democracy, really striking, France is well below Estonia and Poland. Economic performance, you said it, Dimitris, right up at the top, Estonia and the Czech Republic, down the bottom, Greece and Slovakia. If a rejection of European integration on grounds of sovereignty and identity is the issue, then Britain is the most East European country there is, because we left on precisely those grounds. So I would go at this data set looking at multiple differentials, not just individual countries, subnational regions, generations. I think the generational analysis, but I do it across Europe, not dividing us into young East and young West, gender, but also other divisions. So the North-South divide, obviously, but also the legacy of older empires. I mean, it's immensely revealing how on the electoral map of Poland or Romania, the lines of the Russian, German, Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires reappear. Ivan has pointed out that in attitudes in our polling, ECFR polling on attitudes to the Ukraine war, the lines between these older empires appear. So I would take multiple criteria and examine the data on that basis. On teaching, I think it's really important to try and move into integrated courses of European studies. We could say more about that in the Oxford context, but I won't. But final point, I would urge on you, particularly younger mid-career academics, to have larger institutional ambition, right? Because if you're a junior or mid-career scholar, you're coming up against the established authorities in the existing departments. But actually, decisions about these are made by university leaderships, by governments in many European countries, because they're publicly funded institutions, by politicians, and by funders. So go big, write the op-ed, make the case, to the governments, to the politicians, to the funders, to the people who are actually running the institutions, because ultimately the organization of our structures of knowledge is very important in terms of what works get done. So, in the spirit of 1968, the long march through the institutions should begin here and now, and then maybe by the time our undergraduate, our wonderful loyal undergraduate, is a professor, will have changed the institutions as well. Thank you.